The mountains of Spain hold secrets that predate written history. Long before kingdoms rose and fell across the Iberian Peninsula, before Roman legions marched these valleys or Moorish scholars contemplated these peaks, something ancient nested in the darkness beneath the earth, not a relic, not a treasure, something alive, something patient, something that understood, even in those primordial days, that survival sometimes means sleeping for centuries, waiting for the right moment to wake. This is the story of Las Plagas, the story of a parasite that shaped civilizations, toppled bloodlines, birthed cults, and came within a heartbeat of infiltrating the most powerful government on earth. It's a story that spans over 2 millennia, from the Bronze Age to the opening years of the 21st century. A story where religion and bioweapons blur together, where desperation breeds monsters, and where the line between savior and destroyer depends entirely on which side of the parasite you're standing. But like all good horror stories, this one begins not with the monster, but with the moment before anyone knew there was a monster at all. The Forgotten Kingdom pictures Spain around the time of the Bronze Age. Humans have mastered metalworking. Agriculture has transformed nomadic tribes into settled communities. And in this particular corner of what will someday be called Val de Lobos, the Valley of Wolves, something remarkable exists. An advanced civilization has taken root in the mountain caves. The archaeological evidence, fragmentary as it is, suggests these people possess technological sophistication unusual for their era. They built extensively. They carved elaborate chambers deep into the rock. They created infrastructure that would survive in ruins for over 4,000 years. And they encountered Las Plagas. How the first contact happened remains speculation. Perhaps a hunter, exploring deeper caves than usual, disturbed a nest. Perhaps a mining operation broke through into a sealed chamber where the parasites had lain dormant. Perhaps the parasites weren't dormant at all, but active, and this ancient civilization knew exactly what they were dealing with. The truth is lost to time, buried under millennia of geological change and human forgetting. What we know from the evidence comes primarily from later sources. Cave art discovered in areas connected to the ancient civilization, murals found in locations associated with the Ndipaya Kingdom in West Africa, and fragmentary records preserved by groups who would later worship these creatures. These sources depict something that looks disturbingly familiar to anyone who studied parasitology: organisms that hijack their hosts' nervous systems, transform behavior, create collective action through biological imperative rather than conscious choice. The parasites are arthropods, though their exact taxonomical classification remains unknown. They possess characteristics of several different species: the segmented bodies of arachnids, the mandibles of insects, the parasitic life cycle of certain wasps. What makes them unique, what elevates them from mere natural curiosity to existential threat, is their sophistication. Las Plagas don't simply kill their hosts or use them as incubators. They integrate, they form a symbiotic relationship that grants benefits even as it strips away autonomy. Think about that word, symbiosis. In nature, symbiotic relationships involve mutual benefit. The clownfish protects the anemone from predators, while the anemone provides shelter with its stinging tentacles. Bacteria in your gut help digest food, while you provide them with a warm, nutrient-rich environment. Symbiosis implies partnership, cooperation, mutual survival. But when one partner in the relationship can override the other's will, when one organism can hijack another's nervous system and puppet the body like a marionette, does symbiosis still apply? Or does it become something darker, slavery with biological justification? The ancient civilization in Valdolobos apparently made their choice. The archaeological remains suggest they either used the parasites deliberately or were consumed by them entirely. The subterranean city they built wasn't just a dwelling place, it was infrastructure, caverns connected by passages, chambers that might have been laboratories or breeding grounds, signs of organized cultivation, as if the parasites weren't just tolerated but farmed. And then, sometime around the end of the Bronze Age or the beginning of the Iron Age, this civilization vanished. The caves were sealed, the city was abandoned. Whether they fled, died out, or transformed into something else entirely, we don't know. What remained were the parasites, now alone in the darkness, and the spores that would lie dormant for centuries. The first cult, fast forward. Centuries pass. The Roman Empire rises and conquers the Iberian Peninsula, renaming it Hispania. Christianity spreads across Europe, replacing and absorbing older belief systems. The Visigoths establish kingdoms, the Moors invade and create Al-Andalus, and somewhere during all this tumult in the mountains that would become Valdolobos, people began finding the parasites again. We don't know precisely when Los Illuminados, the enlightened ones, first emerged as an organized movement. The historical record becomes clear around 1554, when an inscription dated to that year mentions Prophet Adam Sadler. But the cult itself likely predates this documentation by centuries, possibly stretching back to the medieval period or even earlier. What we do know is that by the time the Spanish Inquisition was burning heretics and forcibly converting non-Christians, Los Illuminados existed as a thriving pagan sect that worshipped Las Plagas as divine beings. To understand why anyone would worship a parasite, you have to understand what the parasites offered. Infection with a subordinate species, plaga, didn't just hijack your nervous system, it connected you to a network. Every infected individual became part of a collective consciousness, capable of coordinating with others, sharing information through means that transcended language or conscious thought. The parasites granted increased strength, resistance to pain, resilience against injury that would cripple an uninfected person. In an era where life was brutal, short, and violent, these advantages weren't trivial. But more than physical benefits, the parasites offered something psychological, purpose. The infected, known as Ganados, experienced their infection not as loss of control, but as enlightenment. They believed themselves chosen, blessed, elevated above ordinary humanity. The parasite's influence created fervent devotion that felt like religious ecstasy. When you're infected with something that makes you feel part of a grand design, that convinces you you're helping birth a new world, critical thinking becomes secondary to the overwhelming sensation of belonging to something greater than yourself. Los Illuminados practiced rituals that outsiders found horrifying: human sacrifice, bizarre ceremonies, behavior that seemed insane to uninfected observers but possessed its own internal logic to those within the collective. The Ganados weren't mindless zombies. They retained intelligence, could speak, could plan, could execute complex strategies. They just did so in service to the dominant species plagas that controlled them, or to the human leaders who carried those dominant parasites. This is where the hierarchy becomes crucial. Not all plagas are created equal. The majority are subordinate species, parasites that can control a host, but are themselves controlled by the dominant species. These dominant parasites function like queens in an ant colony, issuing commands through biological signals that the subordinate species instinctively obey. A human infected with a dominant species plaga gains the ability to control every subordinate species, Ganado within their sphere of influence. They become essentially the living god their followers believe them to be. The cave art from this period is disturbing in its implications. Murals depict rituals, gatherings, mass transformations. They show what appear to be ordinary villagers willingly accepting infection, believing it to be a sacrament. They illustrate the hierarchy, a central figure surrounded by followers, all connected by something the artists represented as tendrils or waves, and they show the aftermath, communities transformed, humans no longer fully human, serving something ancient that they believed would deliver them into paradise. For generations, possibly centuries, this continued. Los Illuminados controlled the region that would become Valdolobos. They spread their faith through infection. They built a society where the parasite was not affliction, but aspiration. And they would have continued indefinitely if not for the Reconquista and the rise of a particular noble family. The Salazar Crusade. The late 15th century marked a turning point in Spanish history. Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married, unifying much of the Iberian Peninsula under Catholic rule. The final Muslim kingdom, Granada, fell in 1492. The Spanish Inquisition, already underway, intensified its efforts to root out heresy. Jews were expelled or forcibly converted. Muslims faced the same choice, and anyone practicing non-Christian faiths found themselves targeted by an institutional machinery designed to enforce religious uniformity through terror. In this climate, Los Illuminados couldn't hide. Their practices were too visible, too alien to Christian orthodoxy. Reports of pagan rituals and human sacrifice reached the ears of the Catholic monarchs, and they dispatched someone to deal with the problem, a nobleman named Gregorio Salazar. Count Gregorio Salazar, later romanticized as Gregorio the Conqueror, led a small army into the mountains. What he found there confirmed the worst rumors. An entire community infected with parasites, performing rituals that involved human sacrifice, spreading their beliefs through biological contamination. To Gregorio, trained in Catholic doctrine and the worldview of the Spanish Inquisition, this wasn't a religious movement to be debated. It was demonic corruption to be purged. The crusade was brutal. Los Illuminados members were tied up and executed by sword. Others were impaled on stakes and burned alive, standard procedure for the Inquisition when dealing with heretics. Gregorio showed no mercy because, from his perspective, he was fighting for souls. Every infected ganado was a person stolen from God, transformed into something demonic. Killing them wasn't murder. It was mercy, freeing their souls from parasitic possession. But Gregorio understood something crucial. You couldn't just kill the infected. You had to eliminate the source. His forces located the caves where Las Plagas nested, the ancient complex built by the Bronze Age civilization. Rather than risk entering and confronting whatever horrors lived in those depths, Gregorio sealed the passages. Stone and mortar, reinforced barriers, multiple layers of protection. The parasites were entombed alive, cut off from the surface world, left to die in the darkness. Then, to ensure they stayed sealed, Gregorio did something remarkable. He built a castle directly above the sealed caves, a fortress that would serve as both defense against external threats and prison for whatever lay beneath. He took on the title of Castellan, the keeper of the castle, and established a bloodline whose primary duty was ensuring the seal never broke. His descendants would guard these mountains for generations, maintaining vigilance against the day something might try to escape. The surviving members of Los Illuminados, those who escaped Gregorio's crusade, fled to a nearby island, cut off from their holy site, separated from the majority of the parasites. They preserved their beliefs in secret. Among them was a man named Adam Sadler. His family and the families of other survivors would pass down the teachings through the centuries. They remembered, they waited, and they planned for the day when they could return, break the seal, and resurrect their faith. Gregorio Salazar became a folk hero in the region. Stories portrayed him as a righteous warrior who saved the village from demonic influence. The Salazar family established feudal control over Valdolobos, maintaining both political and spiritual authority. They converted the population to Catholicism, built churches, eradicated every trace of the old cult they could find. The village became insular, traditionalist, shunning modern technology in favor of pre-industrial ways of life. It was as if time stopped in the late 18th century, preserving a way of existence that the rest of Spain had long abandoned. And beneath the castle, in sealed caves where no light reached and oxygen grew scarce, Las Plagas entered a state that would preserve them for centuries. The parasites didn't die. They desiccated, their bodies entering a form of suspended animation. More crucially, they produced spores, microscopic, reproductive particles that could survive indefinitely in the low oxygen environment, waiting for conditions to change. Centuries of sleep. The centuries that followed represent a fascinating blank space in the Las Plagas story. From roughly 1492 to the early 2000s, nothing significant happened. The parasites slept. The Salazar family maintained their vigil. Los Illuminados survivors kept their faith alive on the island but made no move to reclaim what they'd lost. The village of Valdolobos existed in a kind of temporal bubble, isolated from the modernization transforming the rest of Europe. But isolation breeds stagnation. As generations passed, the Salazar family's role shifted from active guardians to ceremonial figureheads. The villagers remembered Gregorio as a hero but didn't necessarily understand what he'd been guarding against. The Catholic faith that Gregorio imposed gradually absorbed elements of the older beliefs, the way Catholicism always does, saints replacing pagan gods, feast days aligning with harvest festivals, the architecture of spiritual authority remaining even as the specific names changed. The castle itself became less fortress and more ancestral home. Successive Castellans lived there, maintained it, took pride in their lineage. But the sense of urgent purpose, the understanding that something dangerous slept beneath their feet, faded with each generation. By the time the 20th century rolled around, being Castellan was more about property rights and local prestige than mystical duty. Meanwhile, the world changed. The Spanish Civil War tore the country apart. World War II reshaped Europe. The latter half of the 20th century brought technological revolution, political upheaval, the collapse of dictatorships, and the rise of democracies. Spain joined the modern era, but Valdolobos, tucked away in its mountains, remained frozen. The villagers farmed as their ancestors had. They attended church as their ancestors had. They viewed outsiders with suspicion, maintained their self-sufficient economy, and largely ignored the progress happening beyond their valley. It's important to understand this isolation because it created the conditions for what came next. A community cut off from modern education, skeptical of external authority, deeply traditional in its beliefs, is vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who can speak their language, both literally and culturally. And at the turn of the millennium, someone appeared who knew exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. The return of the prophet Osmond Sadler's background remains partially mysterious. We know he descended from one of the original Los Illuminados families, banished to the island centuries earlier. Records from the remake version of events indicate he was the 15th generation descendant of Adam Sadler, the prophet who led the cult in 1554. His family had preserved not just the faith, but detailed records, texts describing Las Plagas, their properties, their location, the methods used to cultivate them. Knowledge that had been carefully guarded and passed down through family lines for half a millennium. Sadler himself possessed scientific training. He was a bioweapons researcher, though how he acquired this expertise remains unclear given his non-Spanish name and outsider status. Some accounts suggest he worked for or had connections to various bioweapon development programs. Others portray him as a self-taught researcher who saw in Las Plagas an opportunity too valuable to ignore. What's certain is that by the early 2000s, Sadler had a plan. He studied the Salazar family. He learned that the eighth Castellan, a young man named Ramon Salazar, had inherited the title as a child. Ramon was alone. His father, Diego Salazar, had died under mysterious circumstances. Some records suggest murder, possibly orchestrated by Sadler himself or his agents. His mother, Catalina, had disappeared after inviting someone described by servants as the devil to cure Ramon of a terminal illness he'd suffered since childhood. That mysterious healer was almost certainly Sadler. Ramon was everything Sadler needed. Young, isolated, sick, desperate for purpose, and carrying guilt about his ancestors' legacy. The villagers despised him, viewing him as a weak replacement for the heroic first Castellan they'd mythologized. He had no family, no friends, no support system, just a crumbling castle, a fading title, and stories about how his ancestor had destroyed Los Illuminados and sealed away Las Plagas. Sadler approached Ramon not as conqueror, but as savior. He presented himself as a prophet, a spiritual leader carrying on ancient traditions. He told Ramon that Gregorio Salazar hadn't been a hero. He'd been a murderer who destroyed a peaceful faith, committed genocide against innocent believers, and condemned the region to centuries of poverty and isolation by cutting them off from the parasite's blessings. Every problem Valdalobos faced, every bit of suffering the villagers endured, stemmed from Gregorio's sin, and Ramon, desperate for meaning, embraced this narrative. He converted to Los Illuminados' faith. He began viewing his family's centuries-long guardianship not as noble duty, but as transgression requiring atonement. Sadler convinced him that the only way to restore balance, to redeem his bloodline, was to break the seal his ancestor had placed, to release Las Plagas, to resurrect the cult. In the early 2000s, Ramon Salazar hired workers from the village to excavate the caves beneath his castle. The workers believed they were conducting routine mining or archaeological work. They didn't know what they were looking for. They certainly didn't understand what they found. Resurrection, the excavation team broke through into chambers that hadn't seen air in over 5 centuries. What they discovered appeared to be fossils, the desiccated remains of creatures that had died and petrified long ago. Mummified arthropods, preserved in the low-oxygen environment, motionless and apparently lifeless, safe to handle, safe to study, safe to extract and transport to the surface. They weren't fossils, they were dormant. Las Plagas had survived not through stasis, but through an evolutionary adaptation that let them essentially pause their life cycle. The desiccation process that occurs in low oxygen environments had transformed the adult parasites into dried husks, but microscopically, they'd produce spores before entering dormancy. Spores so small they could be inhaled without noticing. Spores that could survive indefinitely, waiting for the right conditions, oxygen, warmth, moisture, a host body, to activate and begin growing. The excavation workers inhaled the spores. They handled the desiccated remains, disturbing centuries of accumulated particles. They brought samples to the surface, spreading contamination throughout the dig site, and then they returned to their normal lives, completely unaware they'd been infected. It took years for the parasites to mature. This was fortunate in a terrible way, because it gave Sadler time to study them, understand them, prepare for what would come. When the first workers began showing symptoms, behavioral changes, increased aggression, claims of enlightenment and religious ecstasy, Sadler was ready. He'd established himself as a respected figure in the village by then, using Salazar's endorsement to gain trust. He presented the changes as spiritual awakening, signs that the workers had been blessed by Los Illuminados' holy power. The village was already primed to accept this interpretation. Centuries of isolation had preserved superstitious beliefs alongside Catholic doctrine. The villagers were deeply religious, suspicious of science, believers in miracles and divine intervention. When Sadler, backed by their Castellan, explained that Los Illuminados represented the region's true faith, that accepting their blessing would bring prosperity and purpose, resistance was minimal. Sadler held sermons at the local church. He framed Gregorio Salazar as a tyrant who'd stolen their ancestors' righteous beliefs. He claimed that by accepting Las Plagas, which he called the holy body, the physical manifestation of their deity, they would be cleansing themselves of generations of sin. He turned infection into sacrament, parasitism into baptism. One by one, the villagers agreed to be infected. Sadler had perfected the process by then. Rather than relying on spore inhalation, which took years to manifest, he'd learned to extract plaga eggs from hosts and inject them directly. This accelerated the timeline dramatically. An injected egg would hatch within days, attach to the host's nervous system, and reach maturity within weeks. The transformation wasn't subtle. Villagers who accepted infection experienced profound physical and psychological changes. Their eyes became bloodshot, then yellowed entirely. Their skin paled. Their strength increased dramatically. A farmer who struggled to lift a heavy load before infection could now hurl it effortlessly. Their pain tolerance skyrocketed. Injuries that would have incapacitated them barely slowed them down, and their behavior became increasingly aggressive, especially toward outsiders. But they didn't see these changes as problems. The infected believed they'd been elevated, chosen, enlightened. The collective consciousness the parasites created felt like religious revelation. They experienced direct communion with what they believed was God. Every infected individual was connected to every other through the biological network the parasites formed. They could coordinate without speaking, react to threats with uncanny synchronization, work together toward shared goals with efficiency that seemed supernatural. And at the center of this network was Sadler himself, carrying a dominant species plaga that let him control everyone else. He was their prophet in title and their master in biological fact. When he commanded, they obeyed, not through coercion, but through an overwhelming compulsion that felt like divine will. The parasites had created exactly what they'd created centuries before, a hierarchical society where one leader could control hundreds of followers absolutely, and those followers believed their servitude was salvation. The science of control. While this sounds like magic or supernatural horror, Las Plagas operate through mundane, if extraordinary, biology. Understanding how they work reveals both their effectiveness and their vulnerabilities. The life cycle begins with an egg. In their natural state, adult plagas would lay eggs that are expelled from the host body and must be consumed by another animal to continue the cycle. But under controlled conditions, These eggs can be extracted and preserved, then injected directly into a new host's bloodstream. The injection site doesn't matter much. The parasites find their way to the nervous system regardless. Once inside a host, the egg hatches rapidly. The larval plaga is microscopic initially, but it grows quickly, feeding on the host's blood and tissues. Within days, it reaches the spinal column and begins its integration process. This is the crucial stage. The parasite wraps itself around the spinal cord and sends tendrils into the nervous system, creating a direct connection to the brain. The integration causes symptoms that often get misinterpreted as disease. The host experiences fever, nausea, coughing up blood, hallucinations, fainting spells. They're not sick, they're being rewired. The parasite is establishing its neural connections, learning the host's nervous system, preparing to share control of the body. After roughly a week, the integration completes. The host stops showing symptoms. They seem to recover, but they're not the same person anymore. The parasite is now integrated enough to influence behavior, suppress certain thoughts, amplify others. This is when the religious fervor typically manifests. The parasite enhances feelings of devotion, connection, purpose while suppressing doubt, fear, independent thought. As the parasite matures further, it progresses through three distinct stages, each named in Spanish after its primary characteristic. Guadaña, Said, the first mature form. If the host's head is destroyed or the parasite needs to defend itself, it emerges from the neck. In this stage, it has soft flesh that pulsates, yellow eyeballs embedded in the tissue, and long tentacles. The defining feature is a scythe-like appendage, a blade made from bone, likely the host's own bones mutated and repurposed. The plaga waves this weapon aggressively to defend itself, though the exposed flesh is vulnerable to gunfire, mandibula, mandible, or jaw. A more advanced stage where the plaga replaces the host's head entirely with a mass of tissue that opens like a flower into a four-petaled mouth. This form is significantly stronger. It can grab a victim's head and attempt to force it into the mouth, killing instantly. It also gains the ability to spit acid. The mandibula form represents increased investment by the parasite in physical power at the expense of the host's identity. There's no face left, just the parasite's flesh wearing the body like a suit. Aranya, spider, the most advanced form, where the plaga bursts from the back of the host's head with spidery claws and tentacles. This form maintains more host mobility than mandibula, while being even more dangerous. It can spit acid like its predecessor, but if the host body is killed, the Aranya can detach and scuttle around independently like a facehugger, still capable of attacking though, significantly weakened without the host body's support structure. All three forms share a crucial vulnerability. They're soft-bodied arthropods. Without the host's protective skeleton and skin, they're fragile. A few bullets to the exposed parasite will kill it, even if the same bullets wouldn't have stopped the infected host. This creates a tactical consideration. Shooting the host body damages both host and parasite, but shooting the exposed plaga kills just the parasite, potentially leaving the host alive, though irreversibly brain damaged. The subordinate species plagas, the common variety, follow this pattern. But the dominant species parasites work differently. These are larger, more sophisticated, genetically distinct variants that function like queens. A human carrying a dominant species plaga retains much more of their cognitive function, personality, and free will. The trade-off is significant physical mutation. Their body warps and transforms to accommodate the larger parasite, producing grotesque deformities. But they remain themselves mentally, just with a biological radio that broadcasts commands to every subordinate species within range. The communication method appears to be based on ultrasonic frequencies, sound waves beyond normal human hearing that the parasites can detect through specialized organs. This explains why infected individuals can coordinate without obvious communication. The dominant species issues commands through these biological signals, and the subordinate species Plagas pick them up and translate them into overwhelming compulsions their hosts interpret as their own desires. This system makes Las Plagas uniquely dangerous compared to other biological weapons. The T virus creates zombies, but zombies are mindless, uncoordinated, easily contained. The G virus produces powerful mutations, but at the cost of intelligence. Las Plagas create an army that can think, plan, use weapons, follow complex strategies, and coordinate perfectly, all while believing they're acting of their own free will in service to a higher purpose. The experiment Sadler didn't stop at simple infection. His background in bioweapons research and access to advanced scientific equipment allowed him to push Las Plagas far beyond their natural capabilities. Using the private island that Los Illuminados had inhabited for centuries, Sadler established research facilities and began experimenting with ways to weaponize the parasites. One area of focus was creating dominant species plagas artificially. The naturally occurring dominant parasites were rare, and Sadler needed more to effectively control large populations. His researchers, including Luis Serra, a Spanish scientist who'd previously worked for Umbrella Corporation, conducted genetic modifications to create synthetic dominants. These engineered parasites could control subordinates like natural dominants, but were specifically designed to be more stable and allow their hosts greater cognitive function. Ramon Salazar received one of these synthetic dominants, as did Father Betoris Mendez, the village chief who'd become Sadler's lieutenant. But the most disturbing experiments involved pushing the parasite's mutagenic properties to their limits. Plagas naturally cause some physical changes in hosts: increased muscle mass, enhanced healing, slight structural alterations. Sadler's team discovered that under specific circumstances, these changes could be amplified dramatically. El Gigante emerged from experiments in extreme mutation, taking an infected host and subjecting them to additional parasitic exposure, plus genetic manipulation produced a creature 3 times normal human size with proportional strength increase. These giants were nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, capable of tearing a person apart with their bare hands, and completely uncontrollable. Their intelligence degraded to near animal levels, leaving them as berserkers that attacked anything nearby. They were confined to specific areas and used as biological siege weapons, too dangerous to deploy broadly but devastating when directed at specific targets. Regenerador represented an even more extreme application. By hyperstimulating the parasite's healing properties, researchers created hosts that could regenerate from almost any injury within seconds. Shooting them was useless. Bullets' holes would close as fast as you could create them. The only way to kill them was to destroy the parasites themselves, which existed as multiple nodules throughout the body, visible only through infrared. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, an advanced variant called Iron Maiden added retractable spikes across the body, making even close approach lethal. Verdugo explored insect-like capabilities by somehow combining plaga genetics with arthropod DNA. Researchers created creatures that resembled massive mantises, black armored, incredibly fast, capable of climbing walls and ceilings with claw-like appendages that could tear through flesh and metal. These served as Ramon Salazar's personal guards, intelligent enough to follow complex orders and taunt their prey, but completely inhuman in appearance and behavior. Novistador took the arthropod hybridization even further, creating creatures that combined human and insect traits into something that defied natural law. Flying insects with human-like intelligence, capable of spawning from infected hosts or existing independently. These things could spit acid, fly in swarms, and coordinate attacks with terrifying efficiency. They infested certain areas of Salazar's castle, creating zones where traditional combat became nearly impossible. U3, sometimes called IT, was the culmination of the hybridization research, a chimera combining human, plaga, insect traits, and possibly other genetic material into a massive, multi-limbed horror that couldn't be categorized. It represented the absolute pinnacle of what the research could produce and the absolute nadir of ethical science. Luis Serra's notes suggest he was deeply disturbed by U3's creation, seeing in it the ultimate proof that the research had gone too far. All of these experiments required human subjects. Villagers who showed particular compatibility with the parasites, or who were deemed expendable, were subjected to procedures that usually killed them and always destroyed their humanity. The research facility on the island became a charnel house of biological horror, producing creatures that would have been impossible through natural evolution, but were terrifyingly possible through directed experimentation. Luis Serra documented much of this in research notes he scattered throughout the facilities. His notes reveal a man increasingly disgusted with himself, aware that he was creating weapons that would inevitably be used to harm innocent people. He made particular note of the fact that once a plaga reached adult stage, it couldn't be surgically removed without killing the host. The integration was too complete. The only safe removal method was radiation therapy, using specialized equipment, and even that had to be done before the parasite reached full maturity. The implications were clear. Once infected, and past a certain point, the victim was irreversibly changed. You couldn't save them. You could only kill the parasite and hope the host survived the loss of something that had become integral to their nervous system. For most, survival meant living as a vegetable, brain damaged beyond recovery. For some, it meant death. The shock of losing the parasite would stop their heart. This is why Luis eventually turned on Sadler. The realization that he'd helped create a weapon that couldn't be undone, that had already doomed hundreds of people to irreversible transformation or death, broke something in him. He began secretly communicating with Ada Wong, an agent working for a rival organization, offering to betray Los Illuminados in exchange for protection. He stole a sample of the dominant species Plaga, hoping it could be used to develop a cure or countermeasure, and he built the radiation equipment that could safely remove the parasites, hiding it in his laboratory as his one attempt at redemption. The grand plan. By 2004, Sadler had transformed Valdolobos entirely. Every villager was infected. The surrounding farms, mines, and forests served as territory for the Ganados to patrol. The castle had become a fortress filled with Salazar's biological horrors. The island housed research facilities, training grounds, and a paramilitary force of infected soldiers more disciplined than the villagers. But Valdolobos was never Sadler's goal. It was his staging ground. His true ambition reached far beyond a single Spanish village. He intended to use Las Plagas to achieve what no terrorist, no dictator, no military force had ever managed: complete control of the United States government from within. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Ashley Graham, daughter of the newly elected U.S. President, was kidnapped while traveling home from university in Massachusetts. The operation was coordinated by Jack Krauser, a former U.S. Special Operations soldier who'd been recruited by Los Illuminados. Krauser was infected with a dominant species plaga, giving him superhuman abilities while maintaining his tactical expertise and military training. Using inside knowledge of Secret Service protocols, he executed the kidnapping without leaving traces that would immediately point to Los Illuminados. Ashley was transported to Valdolobos and injected with a superior species plaga, a variant designed to be particularly effective in hosts with strong wills. The superior species granted the benefits of infection without completely overriding personality, creating hosts that seemed normal but were susceptible to control by dominant species carriers. Ashley would remain herself, would pass any psychological evaluation, would raise no suspicions. But Sadler could activate her parasite at any time, turning her into a puppet. The plan called for Ashley to be returned to her father, supposedly rescued or ransomed. Back in the United States, she would infect key figures, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, generals, CEOs, congressional leaders. The infection would spread slowly, deliberately, targeting the most powerful individuals in American society. Within months, perhaps a year, Sadler would control a network of infected agents occupying the highest positions in the U.S. government, and from that position, he could do anything: start wars, end them, manipulate economies, redirect military forces, all while the American people believed their leaders were acting on the country's behalf. It was mind control on a national scale. Biological warfare that wouldn't look like warfare until it was far too late to stop. The beauty of the plan, from Sadler's perspective, was its inherent defensiveness. Even if discovered, how do you fight it? You can't cure the infected without killing them. You can't identify them without specialized equipment. You can't arrest a president or Supreme Court justice on suspicion of parasitic infection without causing constitutional crisis. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The network would be established, the control absolute, the transformation of American government complete. Sadler genuinely believed he was saving the world. In his mind, corrupted by the dominant species plaga and his own messianic complex, he saw modern civilization as chaotic, violent, self-destructive. He saw Las Plagas as a path to forced unity, a biological solution to the problem of human nature. Everyone infected would work toward common goals, coordinated by enlightened leaders like himself. No more war, no more suffering, just purpose, collective action, paradise enforced through parasitic symbiosis. That this paradise required stripping away free will, autonomy, individuality, everything that makes humans human, didn't register as a problem. Sadler had transcended that concern. He believed with absolute certainty that he was right, and he had the power to make the world agree whether it wanted to or not. The intervention. Unfortunately for Sadler, the U.S. government received intelligence about Ashley's location. The source remains unclear. Some evidence suggests Ada Wong leaked the information deliberately, creating a situation where multiple groups would converge on Valdolobos and potentially disrupt each other. Regardless, U.S. Strategic Command confirmed that Ashley had been sighted in rural Spain. They sent Leon S. Kennedy. Leon was an interesting choice for a solo infiltration mission. 6 years earlier, he'd been a rookie cop who survived his first day on the job by escaping Raccoon City during the T-virus outbreak. That experience got him recruited by the government, trained extensively in combat and bioweapon threats. By 2004, he was a special agent with a track record of handling situations that would have killed ordinary soldiers. He also had one crucial advantage: experience with bioweapons. He knew how they worked, how to recognize them, how to adapt tactics on the fly when facing the impossible. Leon arrived in Valdolobos with minimal equipment, a pistol, a knife, and a radio link to a support officer, Ingrid Hunnigan. Two Spanish police officers drove him to the village outskirts and stayed with the car while Leon investigated a house. Within minutes, Leon encountered the first Ganado and realized this wasn't a normal rescue operation. The villagers attacked him with axes, pitchforks, farming implements, and raw aggression that should have been impossible for civilians. They coordinated without communication, surrounding him, cutting off escape routes, forcing him to kill them or die. And when he killed them, when he shot them center mass or blasted them with a shotgun, they kept coming. Injuries that would have dropped a normal person just slowed them down. Worse, when he managed to destroy a villager's head, the standard zombie killing tactic from Raccoon City, sometimes the parasite would emerge, a writhing mass of flesh and tentacles erupting from the neck, still controlling the body, still attacking. He wasn't fighting zombies. He was fighting something smarter, stronger, and far more difficult to stop. Leon made it through the initial village assault and found Ashley in a church on the outskirts. But when they attempted to leave, Osmond Sadler appeared. He explained, with calm certainty, that both Leon and Ashley had been infected. The village chief, Bitoris Mendez, had injected Leon with a plaga egg after capturing him earlier. They were on a timer now. Within days, the parasites would mature, and Sadler would own them both. What followed was a running battle across Valdolobos, through Salazar's castle, and on to Sadler's island. Leon fought his way through hundreds of ganados, dozens of mutated bioweapons, and several boss-level encounters with Los Illuminados leadership. He was aided intermittently by Luis Serra, who provided intel, and eventually the Plagas suppressant that kept Leon and Ashley functional long enough to reach the radiation equipment. And he was shadowed by Ada Wong, whose agenda remained unclear, but whose interventions proved crucial at key moments. The final confrontation occurred on Sadler's Island. After Luis's death at Sadler's hands, after Ashley was recaptured, and Leon himself was brought to the brink of transformation, Leon located the radiation equipment and used it on both himself and Ashley. The procedure was agonizing, using directed radiation to essentially cook the parasites inside their bodies without killing the hosts, but it worked. The Plagas died. Leon and Ashley were free. Sadler, realizing his plan had failed, transformed. The dominant species Plaga inside him mutated his body into a massive spider-like horror, multiple limbs, mouths full of teeth, acid attacks regenerating tissue. He was nearly unkillable, adapted to shrug off everything Leon could throw at him. Only through Ada's intervention, providing a rocket launcher at the critical moment, did Leon finally destroy Sadler's monstrous form. With Sadler dead, something unexpected happened. Every ganado still infected with a subordinate species plaga, everyone still under his control, began suffering seizures. The death of the master parasite sent a neural shock through the biological network, causing every connected parasite to convulse, potentially killing their hosts. Leon and Ashley escaped the island as it exploded behind them, leaving behind hundreds of victims writhing in agony as the parasite network collapsed. The Spanish government, now aware of what had been happening in Valdolobos, enacted a quarantine. Military forces moved in to eliminate any surviving infected individuals and prevent Las Plagas from spreading. The village was essentially destroyed, not bombed or razed, but emptied, sterilized, rendered uninhabitable. The castle and the caves beneath it were sealed again, this time with modern equipment and military oversight. The island became a restricted zone, but samples remained. Ada Wong escaped with the dominant species Plaga sample she'd been sent to retrieve. Her employer, a rival organization to Los Illuminados, now possessed the genetic material needed to replicate and study the parasites. The research notes scattered throughout the facilities were too extensive to completely destroy. The knowledge of what Las Plagas could do, how to cultivate them, how to weaponize them, all of that had been released into the world. The legacy Las Plagas didn't end with Sadler's death. The sample Ada delivered reached Albert Wesker, a former Umbrella Corporation researcher turned bioterrorist. Wesker provided the sample to Tricell, a pharmaceutical company with its own bioweapons division, and Tricell did what bioweapons corporations always do. They improved upon the original design. Type 2 plagas were developed through genetic modification of the original Spanish specimens. These new parasites address several limitations of the original design. They could be forcibly implanted into unwilling hosts by forcing them into the victim's mouth, where they would tear through the esophagus and attach to the nervous system in under 10 seconds. They could control hosts faster and more completely than the original plagas, and they could reproduce independently, allowing infected hosts to spawn new parasites and spread the infection rapidly. In 2009, Tricell tested these type 2 plagas in Kijuju, an autonomous zone in Africa. The test subjects, called Majin, exhibited the same properties as Ganados, but with faster infection and greater aggression. The Kijuju outbreak demonstrated that Las Plagas, refined through bioengineering, had become even more dangerous than Sadler's original version. Type 3 and Type 4 plagas followed, each iteration attempting to address weaknesses or add capabilities. Type 3 combined characteristics of both subordinate and dominant species, creating a hybrid that was easier to control but more unpredictable. Type 4 experiments in Eastern Europe tried to create parasites that could control liquors, other bioweapons, but the research proved defective. The Type 4 eventually overwhelmed and killed its host. The point is that Las Plagas became part of the bioweapons ecosystem. They joined the T virus, the G virus, Ouroboros, and countless other biological horrors in the arsenal of terrorists and rogue nations. The knowledge of how to use them, cultivate them, modify them spread through the dark market where bioweapons are traded, and there's no indication this proliferation has stopped. Back in Valdolobos, the surviving fragments of Los Illuminados possibly endured, with naturally occurring dominant species plagas still potentially hidden in the caves, with spores that could survive indefinitely, with true believers who escaped the purge. The cult might exist even now in reduced form. The faith itself, the belief that Las Plagas represent divine beings worthy of worship, wasn't destroyed when Sadler died. It just went back underground, waiting as it had waited before. The story of Las Plagas is ultimately a story about control, about how the promise of power, strength, unity, purpose can be weaponized, about how biological manipulation can strip away everything that makes us human, while leaving us convinced we've been elevated, about how charismatic leaders can exploit desperation, tradition, isolation to turn communities into weapons, about how science without ethics produces horrors that propagate beyond their creator's intentions. From a Bronze Age civilization that may have used them deliberately, to a medieval cult that worshipped them as gods, to a 21st century bioterrorist who nearly used them to conquer a superpower, Las Plagas have consistently represented the same threat: the erasure of individual will in service to collective control. The parasites don't make you stronger, they make you theirs. They don't enlighten, they enslave. They don't save, they consume, and they're still out there, in caves beneath Spanish mountains, in laboratory samples held by shadowy organizations, in the genetics of creatures bred from their template, in the memories of survivors who remember what it felt like to be controlled, to believe themselves chosen while their autonomy was stripped away piece by piece. The plague that gave Las Plagas their name hasn't been cured. It's just waiting for the next person desperate enough, ambitious enough, or broken enough to believe that parasitic control is salvation. The next prophet who'll excavate the caves, break the seals, release the spores, and promise enlightenment to anyone willing to accept a gift that costs them everything. Because that's the true horror of Las Plagas. Not that they're parasites that hijack your body, but that they make you believe hijacking your body is the best thing that ever happened to you. They make you grateful for your slavery. They make you fight to preserve your own captivity. They make you dangerous not despite losing your free will, but because you've lost it so completely you don't even know it's gone. The mountains of Spain still hold their secrets. The caves still wait in darkness. And somewhere, someone is learning about what sleeps beneath the earth, reading the old texts, studying the research, thinking, what if I could control that? What if I could use that? What if Las Plagas could give me the power to reshape the world? History suggests they won't be the last to ask that question, and the parasites, patient as ever, will be ready with their answer, yes. Come, wake us. We've been sleeping for so long. It's time to enlighten the world again.